This is our first off-season mock draft. We're going to be looking at a real NFL draft from Dan Brugler, taking his landing spots, that projected draft capital, and trying to have a sense of how dynasty rookie drafts may fall this season. Now, this is our first one, so please don't go down there and scream at me when, yes, I do not have Marvin Harrison Jr. at number 1. Instead, we are going to take Caleb Williams. In this mock draft, Caleb Williams goes to the Chicago Bears at 1. And while 100% I agree, Justin Fields was not given a good situation over the past few years in Chicago. And maybe, just maybe, if he was, Justin Fields could have succeeded. Well, coulda, woulda, shoulda. That is not what happened. Justin Fields failed in Chicago. Most likely, they will be trading away Justin Fields, selecting Caleb Williams at number 1 overall. And if we're looking at the situation going forward, the situation should be better for Caleb Williams than it was with Justin Fields. Not only do we have DJ Moore, who was better this season than I ever thought he would be, but on top of this, you also have the 9th pick in this year's NFL draft and whatever additional capital that you are going to get from trading away Justin Fields. While 100%, I'll admit I am not the biggest Justin Fields fan in the world, I will say at the same time that a team like the Atlanta Falcons, if they don't have Jaden Daniels falling to them, they may be willing to go out there and trade for Fields. Now, what does that price point look like? It's not going to be a round 1 pick, but I will be interested to see what additional capital they can bring in. And with Caleb Williams, obviously, if you're the number 1 quarterback off the board in the NFL draft, and you have rushing upside to your profile at the same time. This is a quarterback that has had back-to-back seasons with double-digit rushing touchdowns. Historically speaking, we have seen you hit a round 1 startup pick price point, which is something that we will be betting on here. Now, going over to our next quarterback, I understand, yes, you're going to be screaming at me for not having Marvin Harrison Jr. here. And I do want to reiterate, obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr., by far and away the best non-quarterback prospect in this class, would be the number 1 overall guy in a 1 QB league. Instead, I'm going to be putting Drake May here at number 2, where you have him landing in Washington. It's a great landing spot. I mean, we don't necessarily know the exact situation with the coaching staff just yet, but nonetheless, you're going to have Terry McLaurin. You're going to have Jahan Dotson. You're going to have Curtis Samuel. You're going to have a respectable team overall. The issue is Washington just hasn't had a quarterback up until this point. And while I have no idea if Drake May is going to be good or not, what I do know is he's going to be put in a position to succeed while at the same time have rushing upside. So if you have this kind of NFL draft capital, unless your name is Trey Lance, over the past 20 seasons, we have seen NFL teams at minimum give you 3 seasons starting at the NFL level. And Drake May's quarterback that 2 years ago had 700 rushing yards for North Carolina. So we're going to combine the draft capital, the situation, as well at the same time, the rushing upside. And we've historically seen with this profile that this is a player that can get up to being an early 2nd round pick in Dynasty Superflex startup drafts. Now, going over to our next slot, I understand, yes, you're going to be pulling your hair out. Jaden Daniels. With Jaden Daniels in this draft, he does end up going to the Atlanta Falcons. He is a top 10 pick, and at the same time, this is a quarterback that has almost as much rushing upside as we have seen from anybody not named Lamar Jackson over the past 10 years. We've already done the historical research showing you what it typically means for a quarterback to have this kind of rushing upside coming out of school, and every single instance outside of Trey Lance, which is the one outlier, you're going to see them go up there and be a late 1st, early 2nd round startup pick. It doesn't even matter if they are not necessarily a top prospect. If they get the draft capital and have the starting job and display that rushing upside, you are going to see that boost in value. The best example I can give right now is if you go over to the flockfantasy.com community rankings, you will see that people are currently valuing Anthony Richardson at the 101. While 100% I like Anthony Richardson and I'm not trying to talk down on him at all, it's not like Anthony Richardson is any more of a guaranteed talent than what we have with these other quarterbacks at the top. While he 100% flashed and he looked great in a very small sample for the Indianapolis Colts, the reason people are valuing him over the 101 is because he's a starting quarterback who flashed with a rushing upside, and in Superflex that can break Dynasty Fantasy Football. Whereas our 4th guy here is by far and away the best prospect out of any of these players. You know, there's a difference between going through and building out your big board and just rating guys as prospects overall. And also attributing to them dynasty fantasy football value. It's the similar argument that you see from an NFL perspective with how they're valuing quarterbacks versus running backs. Going back to 2018, it was almost consensus that everybody had Saquon Barkley ranked as the best prospect in that entire draft class. But at the same time, there are a lot of very smart people that are making an argument that he should not even be selected inside the top 10 picks based off positional value in comparison to other slots. It's almost the same thing here, where Marvin Harrison Jr. is by far and away the best prospect in this class. I currently have Marvin Harrison Jr. as the 101 in a one quarterback dynasty league. And if you wanted to take him over Jaden Daniels, if you wanted to take him over Drake May here, he is so damn good. I am completely fine if you want to make an argument that he should be the 102. But at the same time, if we're going to go through and look at how dynasty fantasy football players value veteran wide receivers versus veteran quarterbacks, head over to flockfantasy.com, look at the community or expert rankings, and you're going to see the rookie pick 103 has about 10 or so quarterbacks ahead of it in terms of rankings and value, whereas the rookie pick 103 at wide receiver, you only have 4 or 5 guys that are actually ranked ahead of that pick. So while Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best prospect in the class, it would be a horrible landing spot going over the New England Patriots. And at the same time, historically speaking, you are going to need to see Marvin Harrison Jr. go out there and almost immediately be Justin Jefferson, be Jamar Chase, be a wide receiver one the first day he steps on a football field, which is entirely a possibility if you are going to get him up in that round 1 starter pick range of value for super flex leagues. I'm already ranking him as a round 1 starter pick for one quarterback formats. You can pull all that up on flockfantasy.com. Now, going over to our next guy, we will have Malik Neighbors. With Neighbors, here in this draft, he goes 4 to Arizona. Pretty good landing spot, right? I mean, yeah, you have Hollywood Brown, but Hollywood is never really meant to be the wide receiver one in an NFL offense. Neighbors can be just that. If you're looking at what this man just did at LSU, he averaged 120 receiving yards per game. That was good for a 35% market share number, playing alongside Brian Thomas Jr., someone we're going to talk about in just 1 second, that also goes round 1 of the NFL draft. So Malik Neighbors checks a bunch of different boxes. He breaks out as a true sophomore. He dominates as a true junior alongside other NFL round 1 caliber talent. And on top of that, he is going to go top 5 in the NFL draft, at least according to this mock draft. And we can pretty much guarantee that he will be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft regardless. Super exciting player inside the top 5 here. I don't think you can go wrong with any order of these guys. Now, going over to our next player, we're going to be looking at Brock Bowers. Now, Bowers went to Georgia and immediately cemented himself as one of the best tight ends in all of college football at 18 years old. He had 882 receiving yards that season. And while, yeah, if you're looking at the counting stats, it's gone down, where this past year he only had 714, and definitely the touchdowns were cut in half. At the same time, played way more games back in 2021. It's a little bit of a different offense as well. So instead, if you're going to be tracking the overall market share numbers for Brock Bowers, he goes from about 20% of his team's receiving offense as a true freshman to 21% as a true sophomore to 23% this past year as a true junior on a per game perspective. So you should be super excited. This is someone that you can be penciling in as that top asset in Dynasty, especially if you're playing in a tight end premium format. And if you were to go to the Los Angeles Chargers here at 5, it's pretty much the perfect situation that you could ask for, where obviously you're not necessarily super concerned about the receivers that you have here. Now, going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at Rome Odunsi, who goes to the New York Giants with pick 6. Now, yes, typically we're wanting to see guys only stay 3 years in school, right? I mean, you're wanting to see them declare as true juniors. Historically speaking, that is going to positively impact their expected hit rate and their expected ceiling. But with that being said, this is a wide receiver that didn't really get the chance to. 2020 COVID season. So we're going to throw that out the window. Very unique player that we have to take into account with this data. Outside of that, this past season as a true senior, he has 110 receiving yards per game, which is good for about 32% of his team's offense. And he has about 35% of his team's receiving touchdowns on a per game basis. And there are 2 other quality NFL wide receivers that will be selected in this year's draft that we can say, oh, okay, yeah, that's quality competition. And I understand a lot of people get confused. They say, Mason, how can you say someone like Odunsi has a ton of competition, whereas someone in the same conference doesn't have as much, I'm not looking at the competition of the guys that he's going up against. That's going to be accounted for in the data regardless. We're looking at the competition inside his own offense. If we're looking at the percentage of his team's offense he accounted for, it's obviously a lot more impressive to get to 31% when you're playing alongside two other NFL caliber wide receivers in comparison if you were on Temple and no other wide receiver on your rosters going to the NFL. Now, going over to our next guy, Brian Thomas Jr. is the perfect example of this, right? Because if you're looking at his final year, 90 receiving yards per game, 26% of his team's off, that's not that impressive. And if we were just to look at statistics, obviously this would be a player that's much lower in these rankings. However, we have to take into account you play at LSU, you play with some of the best talent in the country. Specifically, you're playing with Malik Neighbors, who goes top 5 in the NFL draft in this mock draft. So yes, that is serious target competition. However, Brian Thomas Jr. is still able to average 1.3 receiving touchdowns per game, 90 receiving yards per game, and those are incredible marks. And if you go over and look at the Dynasty Land card that we have at flockfantasy.com, you'll see that they love his film as well over there on that prospects tab on the rankings. And yeah, of course, make sure you go to the rankings page there where you can pull up all your favorite YouTubers, Dynasty Fantasy Football rookie rankings. We're now divided into prospects on flockfantasy.com currently, and we have the rookie picks in the overall rankings. This way you can use the trade calculator on flockfantasy.com, be trading rookie picks, but at the same time, have an understanding of how these prospects should be ranked and what you can be expecting to have with those individual rookie picks. Now, going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at J.J. McCarthy. Now, I can sit here and I can pretend that I'm some expert quarterback scout, right? In reality, I'm not, you're not. Let's not try to play that pretend game. And instead, let's say, okay, if the Los Angeles Rams take him at 19 overall, we can safely assume that the Rams will have J.J. McCarthy in their plans based off historical data, typically a mid to late first round pick of the quarterback position in the NFL draft will get an opportunity to start. Now, a big difference between J.J. McCarthy being selected at 19 versus someone like Drake May being selected at 2 is Drake May be Blake Bortles, Mitchell Trubisky level bad, and he still may be able to start year after year after year after year, or at least that's what we've historically seen with every quarterback in the NFL through history, not named Trey Lance. But J.J. McCarthy is more so going to be that mid-round one guy where if you were to have Stafford play for 2 years, then McCarthy comes in and he doesn't pull a Jordan Love. He doesn't dominate right away. You could see him being on a very short leash and a team being willing to move on from him if they don't have the same level of investment as a top 3 pick as you would see with someone like Drake May. He does have some rushing upside. 2022, he got to 300 rushing yards at Michigan. I'm not expecting him to have the same rushing upside as Drake May, Jaden Daniels, or Caleb Williams, however. Now, going over to our next guy, Keon Coleman is a wide receiver that I don't necessarily love from a metrics perspective. Obviously, big-bodied guy, highlight grabs. I mean, clutch player. You're very excited about the overall profile on that front. But his receiving yards, only 54 per game, which accounted for 21% of the Florida State offense this past season. However, if you're looking at the touchdowns, this is where he stands out. He had 50% of the receiving touchdowns on a per game perspective at FSU this past year. This is almost up there with the best player in this class in Marvin Harrison Jr. Obviously, you had less competition overall at Florida State than you do at Ohio State, but nonetheless, super impressive on that front. If you're going over to Buffalo, where Stephon Diggs is maybe a little bit wishy-washy here, it is a pretty good spot overall to say, okay, well, yeah, he can find success in this situation on a relatively weak depth chart. Now, our first running back we are going to have on this list, yes, our first guy will be Jonathan Brooks. Hook'em Lawrence. I mean, obviously not a player that we got to see in 2021, 2022. Yeah, both Bijan and Roshan on the roster. So sadly, Jonathan Brooks did not get to play. With that being said, when he did get in there, he was very efficient, averaging 6.8 and 6.6 yards per carry. But when you have 50 total carries, it's not like we can take too much away from that. However, 2023 comes out phenomenal while he's in there. Of course, we have what happened at the end of the season. But what I really want to point out is a running back that with a limited sample has 25 receptions, almost 300 receiving yards. So Jonathan Brooks is supposed to have the size. He's supposed to at the same time, more importantly, have the receiving capability. It's a good landing spot here with him going to Dallas at 56. It's just a tough spot. If this was a fully healthy running back, we'd be more excited. Now, going over to our next spot, we're going to have Bo Nix here at 12. Now, the storyline with both these next quarterbacks, right, will be what do you have with their age? Bo Nix starts playing at Auburn in 2019. Michael Penix Jr. starts playing at Indiana in 2018. Both these quarterbacks are extremely old. Both these quarterbacks in this NFL mock draft last until the second round. I would be a little bit more comfortable betting on Bo Nix, who had significantly more rushing yards through his collegiate career compared to Michael Penix Jr. And at the same time, Bo Nix goes earlier in the NFL draft. He goes to the New England Patriots, who currently do not have a starting quarterback. And you would have Marvin Harrison Jr. there as well, which immediately vaults you up to having one of the best young wide receivers to play alongside in the entire league. Now, going over to our next guy, we're going to look at another Texas Longhorn here with Mitchell. Hook 'em horns. You're going over to Carolina. Carolina, we can say, oh, okay, yeah, it's a relatively empty depth chart. And maybe this is exactly what Bryce Young needs. The reality of the situation is Bryce Young's probably bad. The Carolina Panthers are probably going to ruin him. And this is probably one of the worst teams going for it. Adam Thielen did manage to be successful in this situation this past year to a certain extent. But it is going to be a very bad situation to overcome. It is interesting in that you almost have a Keon Coleman situation here with Mitchell, where he does dominate with touchdowns over a 40% market share mark, but down there at 20% of his team's receiving yards. Keep in mind, you do have a considerable amount of target competition here with Xavier Worthy as well. Now, Troy Franklin has actually a better overall profile if we are just looking at his market share numbers. Whereas a true junior, he comes out, he has 30% of his team's receiving yards on a per game basis, going over both 100 receiving yards per game and the receiving touchdown per game, which you really like to see. And at the same time, he breaks out as a true sophomore, declares as a true junior. Really like the player. He does fall in the NFL draft here, making it down to 54 for the Cleveland Browns, which would be an interesting situation depending on what Deshaun Watson does going forward. Xavier Worthy is a wide receiver that after the 2021 season, hook 'em horns, I could not have been more excited about. He averaged 36% of our team's receiving yards on a per game basis and 41% of our team's receiving touchdowns as a true freshman. This sadly took a significant fall off his true sophomore year and never got back there his true junior season, even with Mitchell coming over from Georgia his junior year. Worthy does appear to be someone that I would comp to like Marvin Mims, right? Where you have the young breakout age. However, you trail off after getting a bunch of debut players excited about you. I will be interested to see where the draft capital ends up. Right now, he is projected out to be a second-round pick going over to Tampa. But, I mean, this is a player that has size concerns. Now, Jalen Polk will be our next player here. Now, this is a wide receiver that barely hit some thresholds in Washington this past season, but he goes pick 43 in the NFL draft, while at the same time at Washington, he has serious target competition with multiple, and I repeat, multiple players getting drafted in this same draft class at the wide receiver position. So it's a little bit tougher to be excited about him just from a raw spreadsheet perspective. He did stay all 4 years well, but he had a shortened season in 2020, so it doesn't really count. Now, Lad McConkey is going to be someone that people are higher on than I am this year. I'll tell you that much. As a true junior, he barely eclipsed 21. No, he never hit 20% of his team's receiving yards on a per game perspective. He never hit a threshold of breaking out. I understand you're at Georgia. I understand Brock Bowers is there. Mitchell's there for the first few years. But you're a senior who never officially eclipses 20% of his offense. This is someone that I would almost put as undraftable. Very similar to Jonathan Mingo last year. I understand we're going to have a lot of people say, oh my God, look at the tape, look at the tape, look at the tape. We'll watch the tape this offseason. But from a raw threshold perspective, please, and I urge you to look this up without just screaming at me that this player is different. Show me a player that turned into an elite fantasy option that had never eclipsed 20% of his team's receiving yards on a per game basis and stayed all 4 years in school. Now, Jatavion Sanders, Hogan Morris will be our last guy. Goes to Kansas City. Don't love the landing spot in the short term with Kelsey there. But long term, obviously, it can be a very different spot if Travis Kelsey is out the door. Kelsey is 34 years old. So this would be someone that you would really hope that you get the Trey McBride year 2 jump, right? Maybe it takes 3 years. But here he makes it in the second round. Does have some impressive marks from a production profile. Is extremely young at the same time. But that should be it. We talked about everybody who went in this mock draft. Obviously, you have some running backs that we could potentially sneak in here to talk about at the very end as well. Just wanted to primarily stick it with who actually found a landing spot, who actually got NFL draft capital here. I do want to reiterate, while maybe some running backs like Trey Benson end up ahead of the wide receivers at the end of this video, this is not a draft class where you should plan on taking running backs in round 1. Yes, there'll be running backs mixed in round 2, but round 1, unless we get some good landing spots, unless we get some surprises at the NFL Combine and surprises in the NFL Draft, you should primarily be focusing in on quarterback and wide receiver, obviously with quarterback only being in those super flex leagues. But thank you again. Really hope you all enjoyed this video. Really hope you got something from it. I will get y'all with that video tomorrow, and hopefully you can scream at me on why Marvin Harrison Jr. is still more valuable than rushing quarterbacks at the very top.